Frank has a plan. The plan is to work until 67, save enough money, then retire, then enjoy life. Frank made this plan in 2019. Frank still has this plan. Frank's back did not agree to this plan. Frank's company did not agree to this plan, and according to several studies Frank is about to tell you about, Frank's own body did not agree to this plan either. Frank is 54. Frank is tired. Frank's knee makes a sound now. He calls it the click. The click started 3 years ago. The click has opinions about stairs. Frank wants to retire, but Frank keeps hearing a number. The number is $1.26 million. Frank does not have $1.26 million. Frank has a 401k, a Honda that's paid off, and a very strong opinion about airport lounges. So Frank keeps working. And that is the mistake Frank is going to talk about today. 5 reasons Gen X should retire, even if they cannot afford it. Reason 1. You'll probably get pushed out before you're ready. Frank has a plan to work until 67. The data has a different plan. According to the 2025 New York Life Wealth Watch and EBRI studies, most Gen Xers say they plan to retire at 65 or 67. They want to keep working, keep saving, keep catching up. The plan makes sense on paper. The actual median retirement age is 62. Not 67, not 65, 62. Frank's plan and the actual outcome are 5 years apart. That is not a rounding error. That is a different plan entirely. Okay, but that's just an average. I'm going to be different. Frank understands. Frank also thought he was going to be different. Frank has met many people who thought they were going to be different. Frank has not met many of them at the office recently. Of all the people who retired before they planned to, 63% did not choose to retire. They were pushed. Frank wants you to think about that number. 63%. That is not a small group of unlucky people. That is the majority. That is most of the room. How were they pushed? 2 ways. 31% left because of a health event. Not a scheduled health event. Not, I planned to get a bad back at 59, an unscheduled one. A diagnosis, a surgery, a body that simply stopped cooperating with the spreadsheet. 32% left because of a layoff, or a restructuring, or a meeting where someone used the phrase skills gap and Frank's name was subtly attached to it. The company decided Frank's 30 years of institutional knowledge was less valuable than a 28-year-old who knows a software Frank has never heard of. They wouldn't do that to me. I have seniority. Frank is not going to argue. Frank is just going to point at the 32%. So here is the math. Frank wants to work until 67. The data says Frank will probably stop at 62. Frank does not get to choose which 63% he lands in. Frank cannot schedule his health events. Frank cannot guarantee his company keeps him on. What Frank can do is decide to retire at 60 on his own terms with a plan he made himself, instead of being retired at 62 with 2 weeks of severance and a LinkedIn profile that hasn't been updated since 2018. Leaving on your own terms and being pushed out are very different experiences. One of them Frank controls. Frank should probably control the one he can. Reason 2. Gen X is aging worse than their parents did. Frank's dad retired at 65. Then Frank's dad played golf for 15 years. Frank's dad is fine. Frank assumed Frank would also be fine. In March 2026, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a study. The study looked at mortality patterns in Americans born after 1970. The findings were not cheerful. This cohort, which includes most of Gen X, is experiencing worse mortality rates than the generation before them at the same age. Not slightly worse, measurably worse, across multiple categories: cardiovascular disease, cancer, and what researchers call deaths of despair, which is the clinical term for dying from stress, addiction, and the general experience of being a Gen Xer in the 21st century. Deaths of despair? What does that even mean? Frank will explain. Frank will use a coffee maker. Imagine your body is a coffee maker. A Boomer coffee maker ran for 40 years. Same model, reliable, made coffee every morning, retired quietly at 72 and went to Florida. The Gen X coffee maker has been running on the wrong voltage since 1995. The carafe has a small crack, the heating element is overworked, the machine still makes coffee, but it is making a sound now. Frank calls it the click. The Boomer coffee maker expected 25 years of good mornings after retirement. The Gen X model's warranty is shorter, and the terms are different. Frank's parents could wait until 67 and still have a decade of healthy, mobile, pain-free years ahead of them. The data says Frank's window is narrower. The gap between retirement age and the part where your health starts making decisions for you is compressing for Gen X specifically. I eat pretty well, I exercise sometimes, I'm fine. Frank is glad. Frank also knows that cardiovascular disease and colon cancer do not require your permission. Frank is not trying to be grim. Frank is trying to be accurate. The point is simple. Your parents could afford to wait until 67 because they had time after 67. You may not have the same runway. Waiting until the perfect financial moment to start living your life is a reasonable strategy right up until it isn't. Frank would like to go hiking while his knees still work. Frank is bringing this up now. Reason 3, Gen X is getting squeezed from both sides. Frank has a mother. Frank's mother is 79. Frank's mother needs things. Frank also has a 17-year-old. Frank's 17-year-old also needs things. Different things. Equally expensive things. Frank is in the middle. Frank is always in the middle. According to Pew Research Center, 54% of Gen Xers in their 40s have a living parent age 65 or older and are simultaneously raising a child under 18 or financially supporting an adult child. Gen X has the highest concentration of what researchers call the sandwich generation of any cohort in American history. Okay, caring for people is just part of life. Frank agrees. Frank is not complaining about caring for people. Frank is doing math. Sandwich generation caregivers spend an average of $10,000 and 1,350 hours per year managing combined care obligations. 1,350 hours. That is 56 full days every year. A University of Michigan national study found that people managing both caregiving tracks are twice as likely to report substantial financial difficulty compared to people only caring for an aging parent, 36% versus 17%. They are also significantly more likely to report substantial emotional difficulty, 44% versus 32%. Frank is not a statistic, but Frank recognizes himself in these numbers. So what's the solution? Just stop caring for people? No, Frank is not suggesting that. Frank is suggesting something more specific. Right now, Frank is paying for his mother's care and paying for his kids' expenses and working a full-time, high-stress job to fund both. Frank is doing 3 things at maximum effort. Frank is doing this indefinitely. At some point, the math shifts. The kid becomes independent. The parent's care situation becomes more permanent and structured. The middle pressure eases slightly. And in that window, Frank is still working the same punishing job he has always worked, burning the same fuel for diminishing returns. Stepping back from the main career, not stopping, stepping back, often costs less than it looks like because the outsourced care costs that disappear when Frank has actual time to manage things himself can exceed what Frank was bringing home after taxes. Time is the resource Frank is actually out of, not money. I can't just quit my job because I'm tired. Frank is not saying quit. Frank is saying plan. Frank is saying the work until 67 no matter what plan is not accounting for the fact that Frank is already running 3 jobs and only one of them shows up on a pay stub. Reason 4. You probably need less saved than you think. Frank has a number in his head. The number is large. The number came from an article Frank read in 2022. The article said Frank needs $1.46 million to retire comfortably. Frank does not have $1.46 million. Frank has significantly less than $1.46 million. Frank has started avoiding the article. Here's an update Frank may find useful. The Northwestern Mutual 2025 Planning and Progress Study found that the broadly cited retirement magic number dropped by $200,000. It is now $1.26 million. Inflation stabilized, the number adjusted. The goalposts moved, but they moved in Frank's direction for once. Okay, but I still don't have $1.26 million. Frank knows. Frank also doesn't have it. Most Gen Xers don't. The Schroders 2025 U.S. Retirement Survey asked Gen Xers what they expected to have saved by retirement and what they thought they needed. The average Gen Xer expects to retire with $711,771. The average Gen Xer thinks they need $1,111,747. That is a gap of about $405,000, the largest gap of any generation surveyed. Only 16% of Gen Xers think they have saved enough. So we're behind. Great. Very helpful. Frank is not done. The number, the 1.26 million, the 1.1 million, whatever version of it is currently making Frank anxious, is built around peak spending. It assumes Frank continues to spend at the level Frank spends right now forever. Frank right now is 54. Frank has a mortgage or recently paid one off. Frank has a kid at home or just leaving. Frank has work clothes. Frank has a commute. Frank has all the costs that come with being a fully operational adult in the peak years of career and family. At 60, many of those costs are gone or shrinking. The mortgage is closer to done. The kids are more independent. Frank stops buying work clothes. Frank stops commuting. Frank's lifestyle naturally gets cheaper without Frank doing anything dramatic. Financial planners call the years from 45 to 60 the peak spending years. After that, spending reliably drops. If Frank has paid off the house, his actual survivable monthly number is 30 to 40% lower than the comfortable number he has been using as the target. Frank has been measuring himself against the wrong ruler. The ruler was built for a version of Frank that no longer exists after 60. But what if I live longer than expected and run out of money? Frank respects this concern. Frank will address this concern in Reason 5. Reason 5. Retiring early doesn't mean stopping work completely. Frank wants to be very precise about something. When Frank says retire, Frank does not mean go sit in a rocking chair and wait. Frank is 54. Frank does not own a rocking chair. Frank finds rocking chairs concerning. Retirement for Gen X does not look like retirement looked for their parents. Their parents stopped working and that was the end of the story. Full stop, golf, casseroles, done. Gen X retirement is different. The data shows it is already different. According to Hostinger's 2026 Side Hustle Report, 33% of Gen X already has a side hustle, right now, while still working full-time. The average side hustle earns $751 a month. That is not a fortune. That is also not nothing. That is car insurance, utilities, and groceries. That is the part of the monthly budget that makes early retirement survivable, while the main nest egg sits untouched and keeps growing. I don't want to work in retirement, that's the whole point. Frank understands the feeling. Frank is also going to explain why this framing is slightly off. The $751 a month is not Frank grinding through a job he hates. The $751 a month is Frank doing the thing Frank is actually good at, on Frank's schedule for Frank's own reasons. Consulting, freelancing, the thing Frank spent 30 years getting excellent at that a younger person will pay for because they do not have Frank's knowledge yet. Researchers call this the bridge economy. Gen X is the primary target of it because Gen X has the highest level of institutional knowledge of any working cohort. They have seen things, they have fixed things, they have kept things running that should not have been running. That knowledge has value. It has flexible, part-time, work-from-home on Tuesday value. What if no one wants to hire me as a consultant? Frank will answer this question with a question. Does Frank's current employer panic slightly when Frank takes a vacation? Does Frank's manager ask Frank questions that suggest they do not fully understand what Frank does? Has anyone ever said the words, "Frank is the only one who knows how this works"? If yes, Frank is a consultant. Frank just hasn't started charging for it yet. The math on this is straightforward. Frank retires from the main job at 60. Frank's nest egg stops being drained and starts being left alone to grow. Frank does light consulting work that generates $750 to $1,500 a month. That money covers daily expenses. Frank does not touch the big account. The big account gets 3 to 5 more years of quiet growth before Frank needs to draw from it seriously. Frank delays Social Security, delays the big withdrawals. Frank's financial picture in 5 years is better than if Frank had stayed at the full-time job, burning out, spending at peak rate, and counting down to a number that kept moving. What if I can't find consulting work? Frank acknowledges this is possible. Frank also acknowledges that staying at a high-stress job forever just in case is a plan with its own risks, which Frank covered in reasons 1 through 4. Frank wants to say one more thing. Frank is not a financial advisor. Frank is not telling anyone to drain their 401k tomorrow and move to a beach. Frank is saying that the plan most Gen Xers are running, just keep working, is a plan. Frank is not arguing it is stupid. Frank is arguing it might not be the plan Frank thinks it is. Frank is going to go home now. Frank's knee is doing the thing again. Frank suggests you look at the math. If you liked this video, kindly tap the like and subscribe button below and check out this video next. Frank will see you there.